Here's some people hopping in now. I'm going to stop. I was going to say stop recording until we start it.
Okay.
Well, we've got quite a few people that have
Yeah.
joined. So hello, everyone, if you can hear us. We are waiting for our presenter. So we will get started in just a few minutes.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, not sure where our speaker is yet. I heard from her last night. So I wonder if she's having trouble getting logged in.
I think she might be. I think she just sent me a message.
Okay. There we go.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that. I could hear you. I was in the room, but I wasn't in the room as a panelist. I was just having trouble with the panelist link. So I could hear you say, "Where is she?" I'm so sorry about that.
No, that was me actually, Cindy. I was the panelist, and so when I changed myself to co-host, it let you in. I'm
Oh.
sorry.
Oh, well, all the way around. Sorry about that. At least we made it.
All right, well, welcome, Cindy. I'm Laura. Nice to put a face to the name here. And we've got quite a few people logged in and are ready to get going. So you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we can go ahead and get into the presentation.
Sure, absolutely. I can share my, if you want to make me a co-host or something, I can share my screen, or if you want to pop the slides up I sent last night, either way. But my name is Cindy Manginelli. I'm the Director of Community Engagement with the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council. So the council is a national training and technical assistance program, and our job is to provide educational materials, webinars, toolkits, presentations, white papers, all kinds of things at the intersection of healthcare and homelessness. We also do a lot of work around consumer engagement and policy and advocacy. Our website will be on our first slide there, and so you'll be able to see that. But if you want to learn more about some of the things that we're going to talk about today, there's more information on our website, and we'll have other resources to share as well. My background is primarily in direct services. I worked in a ministry here in Middle Tennessee. I'm in Nashville. So in Nashville for many years, and then worked as a children's counselor in a domestic violence shelter. I worked in a detox unit and halfway house for women without insurance coming out of incarceration, doing a lot of work with families and women seeking substance use treatment. Also worked in a health center for refugees and immigrants. And then I've been here at the council for 7 years now, working on a nationally working with partners who are really seeking to discover what it means to love our neighbor, really to what it means to love and care and support and assist those who are experiencing homelessness. So if you want to put the slides up, we'll get started, or I can, if you want to enable me to do it, I can do it.
Do you have the option to share your screen?
When I hit share screen, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
What about now?
Now we are good. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yeah, great.
Very good. All right, so today we're going to talk about housing first and trauma-informed care. And really what we mean by that is we're going to be talking about housing first and how we apply, practically speaking, on a day-to-day basis. What does it look like to apply the model of housing first using a trauma-informed lens? I first heard the phrase housing first several years ago here in Nashville, and I was working with an agency. I was actually doing some work here with the council, and my primary job was to help sign people up for Medicaid, was one of the main things that I was doing. So I had been connected to an elderly gentleman. I actually think he was only, well, he was probably 65, 66, in a rural part of East Tennessee. He was living in an abandoned tractor trailer. And he had lived there off and on for probably 10 or 12 years. And when he had first kind of moved to that region, it was sort of a mini camp. And there were several others that were living there with him. He went by the name Amos, and he's given me permission to share the story. He gave me permission to share it many years ago. But Amos lived there with 6 or 7 friends, but over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, his friends had either passed away or they had moved into nursing homes. And so now he was living there alone. The tractor trailer was large, and he had a pretty good setup in there. Of course, there was no electricity or running water, but there were 2 or 3 homemade steps that he had to climb up in order to get into the tractor trailer. And he'd fallen a few times. He also had type 2 diabetes. And so he had some wounds that there was a lot of concern about. So the local health center had asked me to meet with him to see if maybe it was, see what his options were as far as a nursing home or something like that. So I met with him a few times. He ate regularly. He had a church across the street and a day center a couple of blocks down where he went to get meals, where he did laundry. There was a health center that he was very well connected with a couple of blocks down, and they helped him to manage his diabetes. A lot of people that encountered Amos didn't even know that he was homeless, although he was chronically homeless and had been homeless his entire adult life. But he had found a way to take care of himself, and he had really developed sort of a community around him. I met with him a couple of weeks later. I tried to find him again, and I couldn't find him. And I reconnected with the agency that had made the referral, and they said, he's got a new case manager, met the new case manager, and the case manager said, well, we're now using a housing first model, and he's been housed. She said, I'm going to go check on him in a few days. If you want to come with me, you're welcome to. So we went to check on him. She had not seen him for 3 weeks. She'd put him in housing and then had not seen him for 3 weeks. We knocked on the door. It was about an hour away from the tractor trailer where he'd been staying, totally different part of town. Knocked on the door and no one came. We eventually had to get the landlord. And when the landlord opened the door, the smell just kind of hit you in the face. He was in a chair, and he was alive, but he was just barely alive. And there were roaches, and there were mice and gnats, and it was awful. He was just kind of sitting there and really sort of sitting there in his own filth, honestly. And he was probably 2 or 3 days away from dying. And it was really clear that he wasn't eating, he wasn't managing his diabetes. It looked like there was a chance he hadn't really left that apartment since he'd been moved in. And that was my first experience with Housing First. And I had a very negative impression. And so when people would talk about it, that's the picture that would come in my mind. And I just thought, that's the worst. We're going to kill people, right? And but about 6 months later, I met a young man, same agency. He had aged out of the foster care system. He was 20 years old. He used substances from time to time. He did not consider himself to have a substance use disorder or anything like that, but he also would have had a lot of difficulty passing a drug screen. There was kind of always something in his system that prevented him from being able to do that. He had a few misdemeanors. He'd served some time in juvenile detention. He was really struggling to gain independence. And case manager in the same agency said the same thing. We're using a housing first model. I had so many concerns. I thought, all the different things that could happen to this young man. He was housed. And in his words, for the first time in his life, he was a real person. For the first time in his life, he had housing, and it had his age, his substance use, his criminal, fairly minor criminal history, his maturity level, his job status. None of that had stopped him. And those were barriers that he could never seem to get around. 6 months later, he actually moved out of the supportive housing that he was put in because he could afford better housing. He was working, he was in a steady relationship. But that housing and the support that he received from his case manager, which was eventually became fairly minimal, had for the first time in his life given him a place where he felt like he could have literally a space where he could sit down and say, who am I? Who do I want to be? And he didn't constantly have to be thinking about just literally making it through the end of the day. So what we want to talk about today is kind of what is housing first, because the reality is that for Amos didn't experience housing first. His case manager met him, and the first thing that she did was put him in housing. But that is not the same thing as housing first. Housing first is a model that has standards, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And then we're going to hopefully talk about what does it really look like, practically speaking. What are some of the challenges that housing navigators face as they think about housing first, that agencies face, what's being done nationally to address some of those barriers, what's going really well, what are the conversations that we need to be constantly having if we're going to use a housing first model. So I hope you leave today. I'm not here. This isn't a commercial for Housing First. I've seen agencies that love it. I've seen agencies that said that's not for us. That's for you to decide. This isn't really a prescriptive training. It's more to give you hopefully a really solid idea of the strengths and some of the challenges around Housing First, and give you talking points, thinking points as you wrestle with this as an individual direct service provider, within your agency, within your continuum of care. Hopefully it gives you things to think and talk about to that end. So we're going to define it. We're going to talk about the strengths. We're going to talk about barriers. We're going to talk about what this looks like in some of the more difficult clients and situations that we encounter, and then kind of think about what are the ways that we have to challenge our own thinking if we're really going to use a housing first model. There have been lots of studies that show HUD's is the Housing and Urban Development Department of Housing and Urban Development is probably one of the most popular, but lots of studies that show that if an individual is housed, they are better able to reach whatever goals they have. When I first entered the field decades ago, when we even working in a fairly progressive domestic violence shelter, there were certain fairly challenging eligibility requirements that our clients had to achieve in order to be considered for housing, right? We were going to help them in a lot of ways. But before we put them into one of the housing units that we had access to, which were fairly limited, right? To whatever degree we could control that, there were certain requirements they had to meet. Sometimes, depending on the funder, they had to have a job. They may have to be able to pass a drug screen or an alcohol screening. Sometimes they had to have a certain level of mental stability or demonstrate that although they had a mental health diagnosis, they were adhering to, a treatment plan. They were taking their medication, in other words, is what that kind of came down to. Sometimes we considered whether or not what their rental history had been and the reasons why they had been evicted in the past. And so we worked with a lot of clients that wasn't a problem. They went into housing and everything was good. But we worked with other clients that those were barriers that they were never going to be able, or in their words, in their mind, as they looked to the future. And sometimes as we considered their story, it didn't look like they were ever going to be able to meet those eligibility requirements. And so they were basically stuck in this cycle of homelessness and shelter and unsheltered homelessness. And so there's the research now that the housing first model has been used for a significant amount of time. There's a significant amount of research that shows that those who are housed, regardless of their ability to maintain sobriety, regardless of their ability to work a program, are more likely to have, some studies show, better health outcomes, but also more likely to meet their own personal goals and to function more normally within society. Also, that their hospital use, the time that they spend institutionalized, the time that they spend outside, the time that they spend homeless is significantly reduced. To be honest, there is also research that shows that there are individuals who can be housed using a housing first model, and that there may be, for some of those individuals, an increased risk of suicide and overdose and complicated physical health outcomes, like I said with Amos, especially if they have a chronic disease. And so that's what we're really examining with the housing first model, is for those individuals, and we're going to talk more about this, who are really at high risk, how can we ensure that if they are housed using a housing first model, that they're receiving the supportive services that they need? And that's really what determines whether or not you're using the housing first model. A lot of people say we're using the housing first model, and what they really mean is that, like Amos's case manager, when they meet someone, the first thing they do is seek to move them into housing. And that is not the housing first model. The housing first model includes a number of elements that we're going to talk about today, but supportive services is one of the most important aspects of that. So if you move someone into housing and they do not receive any desired supportive services, then you're not using the housing first model. And so it's difficult with research to determine, are we researching those agencies that actually are using the housing first model, or that just claim to use the housing first model because they prioritize housing people. So research can be a little complicated, of course, in all situations, but that's something to consider here, because if you go online and try to look up research on housing first, you're going to see both. So I want to be really clear about that as well. The reality, though, is, of course, that housing ends homelessness. So depending on what your desired outcomes are, if someone is housed, they're no longer homeless. And so we do see, of course, that homelessness decreases as people are housed, and that's just a simple fact that's really easy to prove through research. So as I said before, the real question here is one of the significant questions here is what comes first. Does someone have to have a job? Do they have to be in treatment? Do they have to have a certain level of mental stability? Do they have to have stable relationships, or at least stable enough that we know that they're not going to move someone into housing who's going to hurt them with them? Or do we prioritize housing first? And so this is an approach that says you are better stationed to get a job, to seek treatment, whatever your goals are. You are more likely to reach those goals if you're housed, right? So client choice is a big part of the housing first model. What is your client seeking? What is the individual desiring support with? What kind of help are they wanting? And so this can be where this model can get a little complicated too, because if the individual says, what I really want is a job, what I really want is to get into treatment, then that is what we prioritize. This is one of the things that went wrong with Amos in the story I told at the beginning. If someone had looked at Amos and said, what do you really want? His answer would not have been housing. When I sat down with him and said, what do you really want? What he really wanted, first and foremost, was that his legs hurt, right? He wanted to get that taken care of. And he needed a lot of help with that because his primary mode of transportation was walking. He'd always walked everywhere he went. It had worked fine. It wasn't working anymore. And so if we don't ask that question and we don't allow the client to prioritize what kind of help they want, and we just say, no, if you come to us, housing is first, then we're not using the housing first model. But if someone comes to us and says, the primary way that I want help is I want to be housed, I don't want to sleep outside anymore, then that becomes the priority, even if we see other things in their lives that definitely need attention, even if we feel like there are other goals that should be prioritized, that the client really directs what kind of assistance they receive. And that our primary question is, how can we help? And then understanding what are we able to do based on what they say, right? Sometimes a client may express a desire to be helped with something that isn't within our scope of work. That's just not something that we do. Do we make the right referral, or do we still push for whatever our agenda is, whether that's housing or something else? So it's really important that we're using this model, and always in trauma-informed care, that we are prioritizing what the client wants. A big part of trauma is the lack of choice. Whether we think about someone who grew up, with a significant number of adverse childhood experiences, someone whose entire childhood was marked by trauma, or we're thinking about someone who's just experienced loss or abuse or war or whatever it is. A big part of trauma is that sense of being trapped, is that sense of not having any choices. That feeling of not having any self-agency, of not being able to make any impact, is part of what reinforces trauma, reinforces that feeling of I'm not okay, I'm not real, I'm not safe, the world isn't safe, right? Those feelings that we think about as being foundational parts of trauma. And so always in the services that we provide, what we want to be doing is opening up doors and saying, you have options. What would you like to do? Some of our clients can't even answer that question. Some of our clients who've just been overwhelmed by trauma, they can't make a choice, right? Even that is really hard. So as much as possible, encouraging the making of choices, the choosing of options, the looking down in yourself and finding a preference and believing that that preference matters is a huge part of working with people who've experienced significant trauma. And the Housing First model embraces that approach as well. So some of us have worked, using the phrase transitional housing, and some agencies still use transitional housing, which is fine. With the Housing First, with transitional housing, at least as it's been traditionally understood, you met a certain criteria, you marked off certain goals, and then you were able to transition into housing. And so you might be in a shelter or working with staff at a day center or some outreach worker, some sort of connection, but you have a plan to transition from homelessness to being housed, and that transition involves the meeting of certain goals or the meeting of certain criteria. And so the idea of Housing First is that transition, that move into housing happens first, and then those goals are prioritized afterwards. A lot of this a phrase I'm sure you're all familiar with is permanent supportive housing, and permanent supportive housing is what we are moving people into when we use a Housing First model. It's targeted to individuals and families with chronic illness, disabilities, mental health issues, substance use disorders, individuals that have experienced long-term chronic homelessness, repeated homelessness. It provides long-term rental assistance and supportive services. That's what we think about with permanent supportive housing. And in theory, permanent supportive housing is permanent. Once they move in, they can stay there as long as they like. So you see that with Housing First, we're not always, but we're often targeting those that in the field we've often called hard to reach or hardly reached because of the barriers they have to housing. Rapid rehousing is more of a short-term rental assistance and services. And typically with rapid rehousing, we would look at someone like I talked about, the young man that aged out of foster care. He has some goals. He has some barriers that are making housing really challenging for him. He was put into rapid rehousing using a Housing First model. The plan was for him to receive short-term rental assistance and services. He obtained housing quickly and then was able to prioritize his other goals. He had the skills. We weren't sure, they weren't sure, but it turned out he had the skills necessary to meet his goals. He just really needed a place to sit and to feel safe and housed to do that. And so he was quickly, within a few months, able to achieve self-sufficiency. That can be months or years, but he did not need and did not want to be permanently housed. He wanted to eventually, like many of us, get his own place, pick out his own house. But he needed a short-term solution. And so these are two different sort of implementations of Housing First. So in Housing First, one of the elements that really defines Housing First is really working to simplify the process. Sadly, there are so many individuals who aren't able to be housed simply because they cannot jump through the hoops necessary to do so. The online portals, the applications, the paperwork that's required, that alone forms a barrier that they can't overcome. So in Housing First, really seek to simplify that process and to simplify the eligibility requirements as well. Working with a landlord, what are the minimum requirements of that landlord? Landlord engagement is something that we do other trainings on, and landlord engagement is a huge part of Housing First. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about that today, but I think you'll see that in the training. But being able to communicate with a landlord, these are the supportive services we're going to provide. Given that we're going to be providing this level of support, what are your minimum requirements? Very often, in order for Housing First to work, the landlord has to be a part of this conversation. And I realize that in the field, we've really villainized landlords, and sometimes for some good reasons. We've really got to challenge the way we think about landlords and our engagement with landlords. But simplifying the process, what are your minimum requirements? What are the minimum requirements of the funder? And this is where Housing First can get a little complicated if you're using various landlords and various funders. But what are the minimum requirements of the funder? Big mistake that I see a lot of agencies make is they don't take these two things into consideration. They say, we're going to use a Housing First model, and we're going to house people regardless of, what their lifestyle looks like. But they don't think about the landlord, and they don't think about the funder. And sometimes we even kind of intentionally skirt, we kind of keep some secrets from the landlord, or we keep some secrets for the funder, or we try to manipulate things. Maybe you've had success doing that as an agency. I've seen agencies get into really big trouble doing that. I've seen agencies that there were lawsuits involved, and they were basically barred from accessing any housing in their region because, in essence, they had lied or they had withheld information. So, you have one housing navigator who bends a few rules and, kind of twists a few drug screenings, and you think, oh, what's the big deal? It can be a really big deal. And we've seen whole communities where the landlords and the funders are extremely suspicious and feel like they're being misled, when the reality is they probably would have been open to housing a lot of individuals anyway if there could have been forthright conversations. So I just say that to say, I would be careful with that and know that it can get really ugly. And then only the most essential information is collected and required, as opposed to long applications and complicated application process. Simplifying all of that as much as possible. Another part of Housing First is simplifying the screening process. And again, I have seen some agencies that say we're not going to screen at all. That's what happened in Amos's situation from the story at the beginning. They met him, hello, got his most basic information and moved him into housing. And the reality is, he wasn't really interested in that. In fact, in a lot of ways, he was being moved almost against his will. He felt a lot of pressure, but also the supportive services that would have been required for Amos were not offered to him, were not available to him, because no one really had a good conversation with him. There was no screening that happened there. And so, of course, you can imagine in Amos's situation, probably all of us, certainly myself and all of us who are passionate about this work, we think about Amos's situation and we feel really, really bad for Amos. And we should. That was awful. But the fact is that in that story, Amos's landlord, who owned, I think a little building that had 6 units in it, that was her whole way of making income. She suffered significantly because of that. It cost her a lot of money to get that unit back where it could be rented again. So the landlord suffered in that story. The neighbors all around him, the entire unit became infested with roaches and mice. They all suffered, right? The agency suffered because boy, that landlord was never going to rent to her again. And they developed a little bit, it hurt their reputation in the community. So no one won in that situation. Sure, Amos was housed. He actually turned out to only be housed for about a month. But everyone lost. And part of that was because the screening process was seen as a barrier to housing, and in many times it is. But instead of adjusting it or simplifying it, they threw it out the door. And so as a result, really important questions that should have been asked weren't. So even in the most basic screening process, there are questions that we would want to consider. And there are questions that we would want to ask as an agency. How will the rent be paid? Of course, is one that I think we don't typically overlook. But will the property and the rights of others be violated? We can be so passionate about housing someone that sometimes we can even kind of get this idea of, well, they should want to help their homeless neighbor, or why does anyone deserve to have someone else be homeless just so that their home works a certain way or looks a certain way. And we really need to take a step back and make sure that as agencies, we're good neighbors, not just to people experiencing homelessness, but that we're good neighbors in general. This is a little embarrassing maybe to admit, but we have we live in a little subdivision here in Nashville, and we have several houses around us that are rental houses, and we just recently had someone last summer move in, and a lot of alcohol use, a lot of loud music, loud movies, a lot of fighting. I have 5 children. Most of them, they're grown, but they're still in and out, and I didn't like that. And it really caused me to pause and think, how many times have I helped someone get into housing? And I knew that person had a history of being a really difficult neighbor, but I really, in my heart, just kind of thought, well, everyone better learn to deal with it. That when people complain about their neighbor, everyone needs to be housed? Why don't you just get over it? And yet when I have a neighbor that's difficult and that sometimes makes me a little uneasy, or that even I think something scary is happening out there, obviously I feel a little differently. So thinking about what does it look like to, what is this going to look like for the landlord, for the neighbors, if we put someone into housing and the police are called and they're arrested, or they do damage to property, again, everyone loses in that situation. So will the health and safety of others be violated? We want to think, of course, of the person that we're assisting with housing. Are they a danger to themselves or others if they're housed? But we also want to think about, will this person engage in behaviors that make it likely that others will suffer? Either their personal rights or their personal property or their health and safety will be violated. Are there health codes or program requirements that will be violated? And then, can this person accomplish the activities of daily living? Can they feed themselves? Can they clean themselves? Are they mobile? If not, what accommodations need to be made? But bravely looking at these questions, and honestly looking at these questions, because again, if we ignore these, everyone suffers in the end. So the Housing First model eliminates barriers like substance use, mental or physical illness, the inability to find or maintain employment, the ability to work a system, and the willingness to commit to a program. While we do simplify the screening and we do simplify the intake process, these are things that no longer keep someone from being able to apply for housing. Now, again, we are keeping in mind, can they accomplish the tasks of daily living? Are they a danger to themselves or others? But one of these factors being part of their life does not automatically mean that they're a danger to themselves or others. Certainly not by any means. There are many people on this call, many people that we engage every day, many of us, one of these factors is a part of our story, and yet we're fully able to manage our own housing and to maintain housing. And so these factors in and of themselves do not disqualify someone from housing using the Housing First model. So as I said, this model really prioritizes consumer choice, the choice of the customer, of the client, whatever term you use in your agency. And that is one of the most foundational parts of Housing First, is that the consumer choice is really magnified. So what resources and supports are most important to the client? What do they want to address when? So again, I don't say you have to go into substance use treatment before you're able to go into housing. If substance use treatment isn't something that you're interested in, or it's something that you're interested in thinking about again in 6 months, that doesn't affect your ability to be housed. Also, when we think about where the person will be housed, under what circumstances, and when, as much as possible, the consumer has input into all of those areas. Sometimes almost every time I do this training, someone says something to the effect of, what kind of magical world are you living in where you have all these units in all these different locations and the client can just come and pick and I realize that is a bit of an ideal sort of description. However, if we look at someone like Amos that I talked about at the beginning, if he could have had some options about his housing, he actually would have chosen to stay in the trailer rather than move an hour away. And so having that conversation, even though it's not going to help our outcomes, and even though it's not ideal, where Amos needed to live in that community, the trees, the stray dog, the lady who worked at the Dollar Tree across the street, this was his world. And it was more important to him than housing. And so having that conversation about where was going to be really an important part of his intake, because he would have chosen something right there, or he would have chosen to live in a place that for us seemed completely unhealthy and inappropriate. So, you may have lots of options that you can give clients. You may not. You may be asking them, given your options, what would you like to do, right? Again, we're not here to solve anyone's housing problem. We're not here to wave a magic wand and make someone's life look a certain way. We're here to offer to help them meet their goals, right? So that preference is a big part of this. And, we talked about the significance of preference when working with people who've experienced trauma. And then what supportive services does this person need in order to succeed in housing? We, during the pandemic here in Nashville, we had in the very early days in April 2020, the city took our fairgrounds here in Nashville and basically took 3 enormous gymnasiums and made them into housing for people to isolate them, which of course now with what we know about COVID was, it was awful. But so there was this enormous gymnasium with cots 6 feet apart, and there were probably 300 people in there. And it was people who were almost always unsheltered. So I walked in to do some, to try to help set up services. Really, it was a sort of amazing how much we were not able to do in those early months. But I had an outreach worker with me who'd been an outreach worker in our city for like 10 years. And he walked in and he looked around and he just stopped and he just started pointing and saying, him, her, them. And I looked at him and he said, these are all people that I've housed before. He said, I'm looking at 100 people that I've already housed in the last 5 years. And because they never gathered together, he'd never seen together, sort of in his mind, what felt like an enormous failure. But as we talked, he realized, and he had already known this, that none of them had been asked, what do you need in order to succeed? They'd been housed, they'd been given a key, they'd been given a handful of brochures of all the different, agencies available, all the different services available to them in the city, but they needed more than that. They needed someone to come knock on the door. I sat at a conference last summer where someone in an agency, I believe in Philadelphia, that's doing phenomenal things with Housing First, said that their case managers have a load of 1 to 6. And they actually go and empty out the trash and they run the garbage disposal and they unload the dishwasher. These are people with master's degrees. And at the same time, they help manage medication and arrange, support people in their treatment. But he said, that's what those individuals need. They cannot stay housed if they don't have someone to help them with their garbage. They don't have those skills right now. They may never. So what are the supportive services that have to be engaged? Realistically, what can we offer is a big part of this conversation. Other barriers that do not, again, when we think about supportive services, these are some of the categories that we have to think about. Physical health very often falls off this list. For Amos, that was a huge one. How's he going to manage his diabetes? How's he managing it now? Well, if he moves away from the health center, it's not going to be managed that way. So physical health, mental health, substance use, peer support. Are we taking this person away from their friends, from their community? Are they, that's terribly worded. The reality is, are they making a decision to move away from their support system? Are we encouraging them that way? That was a big part of Amos's decline in housing, was that the people who came around him were all gone. And that in that loneliness and that isolation, he just collapsed. You know, he just couldn't do it. Probably most of us couldn't. So what are the support systems in place, and how will they continue is again on this list of questions we need to ask, of supportive services that we need to think about how we're going to offer. Physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, and social needs addressed. What are those, and how are they going to be addressed? A big part of the Housing First model is ensuring that those that we're assisting are able to socially integrate. How will they become functional, thriving members of the community in which they're moving, into which they're moving? How will we support them in doing that? If that happens successfully, then some of the supportive services that we need to offer will no longer be necessary, because they, just like us, will be receiving support from their community and offering support to their community, right? They'll be giving and receiving from their community. How do we help that happen? And agencies are doing a lot of creative things around that. Some agencies are having activity nights, or planning an activity every month, planning outings where they pick up everyone who's in permanent supportive housing and take them all to all different kinds of activities, starting community calendars, being intentional about connecting those in supportive housing with the local community center, with the local gym, with the local faith-based communities. This is a ton of work, but part of Housing First is helping those who are receiving housing integrate into their community. And in the Housing First model, they would receive these services for as long as they want, and the services would not be mandatory. So again, if they're not receiving the supportive services that they need, then you are not using the Housing First model. That is essential to the Housing First model, that they receive all of the necessary care, that it's available to them. It's not forced upon them, right? So some of the fears that some of the negative aspects of Housing First that we talk about are fears that are really addressed by supportive services. The fear that something will happen like happened to Amos, that they will just, the chronic conditions, their medical care, they will just, they'll just kind of fall apart. How are we going to keep that from happening? A big part of that is very specific supportive services. Amos would have needed someone to help him with his blood sugar almost every day. Otherwise, he could not function in that housing unit. Those with severe chronic mental illness will be danger to themselves or others. Again, that's one of the arguments we hear against Housing First. And so those supportive services have to be in place. That those with substance use disorder will overdose or relapse, and that is one of the dangers. That is one of the things that we're trying to address with Housing First, is how can we make sure someone's living in a camp and they've got 25 people around them. If they overdose, there is a good chance that someone will see that in many of the camps that I'm sure you've seen and that I've seen. Whereas if someone is living in an apartment alone, they don't have that person, putting their eyeballs on them. So how are we going to provide the supportive services that will provide that same sort of community? That those desiring employment will not receive job coaching and placement assistance, and that landlords and funders will not trust our agency, like the examples I've given. So these are things that we have to talk about and think through as we think about real barriers to Housing First, or really attempts at implementing the Housing First model that aren't really adhering to the model, right? Sometimes, and this is what's happening some, is that agencies decide to really move forward with Housing First, But 6 months in, what they're doing is not housing first because they can't provide the supportive services. They aren't able to find units for people who come in unless they meet this long list of criteria. And so for a lot of agencies, it's a little bit of a 2 steps into housing first, 2 steps back, and it's a very slow transition. Or some clients experience the benefit of a true housing first model and some don't. So don't kind of beat yourself up as an individual or as an agency if you realize, wow, we can't seem to implement this across the board. A lot of agencies have to think about how they apply it, which again is not how it was intended to function, but practically speaking, that is what some agencies are having to do. So again, if we ignore the client's preferences, it's not housing first. If a client comes to us and says, I want to live in a community living environment. I need to be in a halfway house. I need that kind of accountability. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for inpatient treatment. If that's what someone's looking for, then that is what we would prioritize. And so that's a big part of this, again, is asking the right questions and listening. But there are individuals who really want that kind of constant community, constant accountability. And so we want to make sure that those kinds of referrals and those kinds of community partnerships are still part of our program. Some people are afraid with housing first that there'll be this rush of people that are using the housing first model in order to just be immediately housed. And so, again, we said at the beginning that ideally housing first is a model that's applied to those who have a lot of barriers to housing. And so there are some agencies that feel like either what they're afraid is going to happen or what has happened is that people have rushed into their agency because the understanding is as soon as I walk in the door, you're going to help me find housing and all of the help I need. When in reality, that individual may be able to support themselves on their own. You know, if they are we helping people get housing who then don't have to work? Some of this is the conversation we always have around homelessness and the stigma around homelessness. But I think we do have to talk about that. There are so many conversations that we avoid because we're afraid of increasing stigma. I've worked with communities that cannot talk about safety and security, that cannot talk about, individuals that may be taking advantage of their program, because they're afraid that they'll increase, the horrible things that people think about people that are homeless. Part of our work is to be brave enough to have those hard conversations and to say, yeah, we don't believe this is true about all people experiencing homelessness. It can be true. And being able to balance that realistically. And so there are brave conversations that have to be had around this as well. More barriers that I think, again, are just part of the talking points that if we're going to use the housing first model, we constantly have to be talking about how to create strong, honest relationships with landlords, mitigating risk for landlords, incentivizing landlords. There are all different ways to do this. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this in this training, but again, your landlord relationships are going to be really important to thinking about housing first. So are your community partners, and even thinking outside the box about things like roommates and things like that. Need to be part of the ongoing conversation. As we've said, if there's no supportive services, it's not housing first, and that's where a lot of agencies can feel really stuck. And so we're seeing a lot of agencies and COCs try to really think outside the box around this and think about who are the community partners, especially in rural areas, that can help us provide supportive services. And so constantly looking for others who can help with these supportive services. For those who are in domestic violence situations, for youth, those with chronic illness, and those in rural areas, there are special things to consider. I have worked with domestic violence shelters who were using a housing first model and really did not consider how much confidentiality and safety and security have to be part of the conversation. And so again, a lot of this comes down to really listening. Unaccompanied youth, especially youth under the age of 18, there are still things to consider with housing first, like can they legally be housed? You know, what is their maturity level? There's new questions around safety and security that have to come up if you're thinking about applying a housing first model to young people. Those with chronic illness, like Amos that I mentioned at the beginning, who will really need a lot of support or they could die. And then in rural areas, offering supportive services can be really challenging. And so that's where we really have to think through community partners and where someone feels like they can live safely. So in the last few minutes, let's think about a few sort of what we would think about. What does this practically look like? Someone's walk in my office, high risk situations. This is Katie. Katie got married when she was 17, married her high school sweetheart. She's been married to the same man for 20 years. And throughout that 20 years, it's been an abusive relationship. Her husband has been physically, mentally, sexually abusive. In coping with all of that and just struggling with depression and anxiety, she has attempted to take her own life a number of times. And when she comes into your domestic violence shelter, she has come straight from institutionalization. She was just institutionalized for a month after a suicide attempt. She also is on a lot of anxiety medication, and she has overdosed on that anxiety medication before, accidentally. And so there's some issues there. And so we look at someone like Katie, and with Housing First, you know, there's always questions. Katie comes in and she says, "No, I'm not feeling suicidal. No, I've got my medication managed. No, I'm not planning to move my abusive husband of 20 years into my unit with me, but I really want to be housed." Her desire is to be housed. And so agencies there can be a lot of tension and a lot of division caused in considering situations like Katie's. And do we talk to Katie based on what she's saying today? To what degree do we take into consideration her story? She's never lived by herself. She's had a lot of struggles with substance use, and in one way or the other, how it's with depression and anxiety. And so with situations like this, it can sometimes be helpful to think about it in reverse. Again, hopefully you have policies and procedures in place that guide you in situations like this. But if I were to knock on Katie's door, just knock on her door, sit down and have a cup of coffee with her, and if today she was housed and I knocked on her door and sat down and had a cup of coffee with her, would I determine based on my assessment of her condition that she needed to be removed from housing, right? Probably not, unless she is truly a danger to herself or others. There are lots of people who are housed who suffer with severe depression and anxiety, who have people come and stay with them who are dangerous, who sometimes their medication gets mismanaged and they take too much medication. There are lots of people like that, and they are not removed from housing, right? So sometimes in some situations, it can help to look at this in reverse. It also can be helpful to think about realistically, what services is Katie receiving in shelter? Is she on suicide watch in shelter? Are we managing her medication in shelter? Probably not. So sometimes we hold people, we decide that people need a level of care that they're not receiving on the street, they're not receiving with their abusive partner, and they're not even receiving two doors down from us, two doors down from my office, right? Realistically, we're not providing the level of care that we say that she has to have in order to be successfully housed. So what you do in a situation like this is up to you, but these are ways of framing the conversation that may be helpful. Those throughout our community who struggle with depression, anxiety, medication management, where do they find the help that they need? And could Katie find help there? Would also be a question to ask. Another example of a situation that we often talk about with supportive housing is demonstrated here by Andre. Andre aged out of the foster care system. He's 25. He's got a job, but he regularly loses his housing because he really struggles with anger management. He's done a lot of damage to a lot of different units. 911 is called because people can hear him in his apartment raging. He rages at his neighbors. This is how he acts 10% of the time. Most people who meet Andre think he's amazing, he's awesome. But when he loses control of his anger, it can be really, it can be dangerous. It can be unpleasant. It scares people. So what do we do? You know, if he's has a history of doing significant damage to units, of not being a good neighbor to the point that neighbors are calling 911, what do we do? And so when we look at situations like this one with Andre, very often what can be helpful is to really fall back on a strengths-based approach. What has worked for Andre? That's a question we should constantly be asking for all kinds of models, but especially with Housing First too. What has worked? Andre has actually done really well living in his car, but he doesn't have electricity, and there's obviously challenges to that. So Andre was eventually housed in a RV. So basically, he needed to live alone. He needed to live in a small space that made him feel really safe, and he needed to live in a place where he didn't have neighbors on either side of him. That was always going to be problematic for him. We couldn't know that unless we spoke to him, unless we did a really good screening, unless we did some motivational interviewing. But that question, what's worked for you in the past, can sometimes be really, really important. And then considering with some of our neighbors that we're trying to assist, what are the different kinds of property? What are the different kinds of scenarios that will work? We talked about Amos at the beginning. One of the barriers with Amos is Amos could not stand to hear people below him, above him, on his left and his right. And he was in an apartment where that was happening. And that was just maddening for him. He had served some time in prison, and that reminded him of prison. And it just, the trauma, the fear, the panic, it just was overwhelming to him to have people living all around him. And so you didn't know that about him unless you really sat and talked to him. And he didn't even know that about himself until there were really some conversations around, when you've been housed in the past, why didn't it work? Why, So again, that strengths-based approach, what are the reasons this person may or may not want to be housed? Are those things that we can look at? These are all things to consider when we're talking about Housing First. And then I think it's important that you really think about, what do I believe about housing? There's some truth in each of these statements. Each of these statements do reflect some reality. But if any of these statements really govern the primary way that we think about housing as an individual or as a team, it can make Housing First really challenging. So these are questions that we kind of have to wrestle with in our own heart and our own mind if we're going to use a Housing First model. That's just the reality of it. The idea that housing must be earned or deserved, that housing is only for those who behave a certain way, that if we reward with housing socially unacceptable behavior, individuals will be less likely to change. That I have to control, or society has to control or monitor or police certain individuals. That housing high-risk individuals jeopardizes the reputation of our program and our relationship within the community. And that I know what clients really need, what's really best for clients. Again, there may be elements of truth in all of these. But if these are our guiding, our foundational beliefs around housing, we're going to have to wrestle with those in order to really think about Housing First. I've put some resources here. Housing First University. This is a link, and of course you're watching, you won't be able to see it this way. And if the slides are shared, you'll see it. But it's called Housing First University by Pathways to Housing. Excellent. So this is this much of what I've talked about, and they have this much. So I would encourage you to go there. So many good resources, so many good explanations. We have lots of permanent supportive housing resources, which are also tied to Housing First at our website, NHCHC.org. And then the National Alliance to End Homelessness, usage, others, lots of resources available that I would encourage you to check out. I'm happy to talk more about this. Feel free to email me if there are questions or ways to facilitate more communication around this. Again, hopefully today you leave with lots of talking points and ways to move forward, constantly considering what a Housing First model would look like for your agency.
I know we're almost at time, but Greer had some really good questions in the Q&A. Can you see them, Cindy?
Yes, let's see. Oh, that is a really, really good question. These are, Greer, these are the questions. These are the questions that we really have to think about. There's so much pressure using a housing first model to house people and to house people in a certain amount of time. So we constantly have to balance, when we think about a client's preferences, there are I talk a lot with clients about there are things that I don't like, and there are things that I cannot do, right? And that's how I try to talk with clients about preference, because sometimes you'll talk to clients that'll be like, well, I don't like this, but what they really mean is I can't do that. Amos said to his case manager, I don't really want to live there. When the reality was he can't live there, right? And then we have a whole lot of clients who say, I can't do that, when what they really mean is it's not my favorite. So trying to develop a way to talk about preferences that really gets down to, this is a preference like it would be awesome, or this is a preference like I'm going to die if I have to do this. That can be helpful. Also, looking at clients and saying, this is what I can offer. What is your preference? Is very different than, here's everything in the world. What is your preference, right? This is what we have to offer. Do any of these sound good to you? What sounds best to you? What do you like about these? Gets kind of down to the heart of the matter, right? And then, of course, lots of questions about those who can't, with the ADLs, with the activities of daily living. Again, lots of questions around there's a difference between needing supportive services and needing accommodations, and then needing inpatient care. And these are ways too that we have to frame these conversations. Does the individual need someone to basically just need someone to come by and check on them because they're unable to perform some of the tasks of daily living? Or do they need someone come by every day and help them in that initial getting out of the bed? I had one client that did pretty well all day, but they had to have someone put them to bed at night. They weren't able to navigate that process of getting ready for bed, or of the process of getting up in the morning. Well, that's pretty tricky, right? But the rest of the day, they were fine. So which of the activities of daily living can they not accomplish? Is there support that we can offer that meets that need? Or in fact, do they actually need an accommodation? Like you have to have a unit that has a ramp. So defining that as clearly as possible. Again, lots of conversations that have to take place over that. I know we're out of time, but those are phenomenal questions. I'm happy to talk more over email as well, if that would be helpful. Or if there are groups of people who want to talk more about some of these questions and that's something the group wants to facilitate, I'm happy to do that too. I would encourage you to go to Pathways to Housing's Housing First University. They have lots of information there about accommodations and assisting those with special needs, that I think would be really helpful, especially with that question. But yeah, very, very good points.
Yes, we will have these the last few questions downloaded in the webinar here, so I will send those out to you, Cindy, and then yeah, I want to respect everyone's time, so yes, that is all we have for you all today. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you so much, Cindy, for being with us today.
Much appreciated. I think you've given us some good pointers, some things to think about, and I think some good discussion is going to get generated out of this. Thank you.
Good. It was good to be with you all today.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.